Diop went to this conference on the peopling of ancient Egypt. Now, I want you to listen to this very carefully. After many years, more than 2 centuries in which European universities and academics have stated that Egypt is Caucasoid, or it is Semitic or Hamitic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic, eventually they invited Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga. This is the first time at any international conference on an intellectual matter that Africans are invited to deal with their own story. Theophile Obenga, he wrote me last week. This is the first time I'm hearing from him, because apparently Diop left a lot of papers after he died, and so several people in France and French-speaking Africa suddenly become aware of the journal for the first time. Theophile Obenga is an expert on Bantu. He's head of the Bantu Research Institute in Brazzaville. He's a great linguist, like Diop. And they appeared at this conference. Everybody else was European or Arab from the Arab Republic of Egypt. And at this conference, everybody came unprepared except the two Africans. Could you imagine that? This is a conference meeting, an academic conference meeting to discuss the peopling of Egypt, and these guys arrived empty-handed, talking from their heads. The Africans arrived with heavily researched papers. The linguistic evidence of Diop was so startling that everyone had to admit this is one of the revolutionary things that Diop and Obenga, particularly Diop, had proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that Egyptian language was not Semitic or Hamitic, it was African. But there is where the agreement ended, because when Diop tried to show that not only the language was African, but that the people were African, everybody got upset. And those people who couldn't say that it is not so, they said, we mustn't talk about race anymore. We are all human beings here. Let's stop talking about race. So let me read you the passage from my introduction which deals with this. A summary of this conference is of interest and value to readers, since it reveals the state of Egyptology at the moment and the defensive reaction to the question of blackness or Negroness. Professor Galab of the Arab Republic of Egypt declared that the human race during the Paleolithic era, which is the Stone Age, was more or less homogeneous and Caucasian, meaning to say all human beings were first white. This is an Egyptian, and that Negroes only began to appear much later. A Negro culture, he claimed, did not appear prior to the Neolithic, that is the age of agriculture. Professor De Bono of Malta spoke of a race of pyramid builders coming into Egypt, a race with Libyco-Asiatic affinities, without even deeming it necessary to show where on this earth stands the proto-pyramid that this race constructed before it migrated to Africa. How could you have a race of pyramid builders who never built pyramids anywhere else? Several participants, finding it difficult to demolish Diop, decided instead to demolish all talk about race. Professor Saf Soderberg of Sweden, while demonstrating that the majority of Neolithic cultures in the Nile Valley belong to techno-complex of Saharan and Sudanic cultures, said the concept of race was outmoded and should now be abandoned. After he showed that the technology of the early Egyptians is Sudanic and Saharan, which is African, he said, don't talk about race. Race is outmoded, must be abandoned. Professor Vorkuta of France, insisting that there was no way to tell how many of the Egyptians were white and how many were black, felt the evidence nevertheless showed that Egypt at least was African in its way of writing, its culture, and its way of thinking. Now just imagine that. You can't tell how many white people are there, yet everything they're doing is African. In other words, they're white Africans. These white Africans, their language, they said, is African. Their culture is African. Their science is African. And yet you can't tell whether they're white or black. Professor Shinny of Canada said that Herodotus and all the Greeks and Romans who called Egyptians black were merely being subjective like Dr. Diop. race was not a scientific concept. Professor Mokhtar of the Arab Republic of Egypt said the problem of race was unimportant. Professor Abdullah of the Sudan, after chiding Diop for adopting an Africanist approach to this problem, went on boldly to assert that the Egyptian language belonged to the family of Proto-Semitic languages and that there was abundant evidence to prove it. He had not come to the conference, however, with his abundant evidence. This, in fact, was one of the remarkable revelations of this international conference. In its final report, UNESCO pointed out, quote, listen to this, although the preparatory working paper set out by UNESCO gave particulars of what was desired, not all participants had prepared communications comparable with the painstakingly researched contributions of Professor Sheikh Anta Diop and Ubenga. The Africans at last had done their homework, and those theses, which had once seemed formidable, now shook with the fragility of leaves in the new intellectual wind blowing from the continent. All the time they had had their own way until they had become intellectually flabby. This is one of the things that I have noted. When I was in Arizona some years ago, I had to fight with someone they called an expert on Mexico. And when I opened up on this guy, I realized that I wasn't fighting an equal, that he couldn't fight because he'd never fought in his life. We have to fight. We have to fight for every inch of ground. Nothing is yielded to us without a struggle. But they always took it for granted, as my mother used to say, they're born with golden spoons in their mouths. And so when at last he met a fighter, he couldn't fight. When I started on him, I suddenly realized, I said, animals, when they fight like apes, etc., when they're about to overpower you completely and they realize that you are losing, the ape pulls back. Man doesn't usually pull back. And there is something Christian in me which said, you got him on the ground now, let him go. And there's something devilish in me that said, let him go, my foot. He has trampled us for centuries. These are the kinds of men who have destroyed us for centuries. They are still destroying us. Our children are being destroyed. Don't let him go. The time has come to kick these people. When the knowledge arises, there is no compromise here because we are dealing with something savage and brutal. It is impossible to become involved in black history without becoming involved in politics. Because to reconstruct the history of black people anywhere in the world, you have to fight against a climate of great prejudice.
A white man that I've worked for, if he's alive today, he's a little over the capital L. His name was Dag Steiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. He spoke kindly. He said, John, I'm sorry that you came from a race that's made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you make history someday.
When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree.
In terms of scholarly debates, we know of the work of Sheikh Anta Diop, and he's played an important role in verifying the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians. Robin, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Professor Sheikh Anta Diop was a scholar from Senegal. Why he's important is that he wrote a book called Nation Negre et Culture, but the English came out as The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. That book came out in 1974, and because it was now in English, it attracted a very wide interest. In that book, Professor Diop presents essentially part of his doctorate thesis. And his doctorate thesis was not just that the ancient Egyptians were black Africans, but also that other African culture can be related to ancient Egypt in much the same way that European culture is related to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. Same idea. Now, what Diop presented was, first of all, he went through the various classical scholars. Now, the classical scholars are the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and he presented 10 examples where they described the ancient Egyptians. And then if you go through some of the examples, there's an ancient European scholar called Herodotus, who was an ancient Greek scholar. He said the ancient Egyptians had black skins and woolly hair. Lucian says that the ancient Egyptians were too black, then describes them as having thick lips and bandy legs. Other scholars, Diodorus Siculus, suggested that the Egyptians actually descended from the people of what we would now call the Sudan. And when we examine our 10 scholars, they paint quite a detailed picture of what did the ancient Egyptians look like. Then Professor Diop went in search of positive proof, and what he did was he had access to a series of mummies that were excavated by a gentleman called Mariette. And the Mariette excavation mummies, Diop removed elements of mummy skin and had that skin examined. Essentially what he was looking for was the evidence of a high quantity of melanin or the absence of a high quantity of melanin. And that way we could work out, are we dealing with Negro skin or non-Negro skin? Diop suggested that all the mummies found at the Marietta excavations, all of them had Negro skin. The next thing then was UNESCO commissioned something called the General History of Africa. That took place in 1974. Now, the big sticking point was going to be, where is ancient Egypt going to fit into these volumes, the General History of Africa? So they called the debate, and the debate was called the Cairo Symposium. And at that debate, 2 scholars presented a case that the ancient Egyptians were Africans, and 18 scholars presented a case that the ancient Egyptians were Europeans, Asians, non-Africans. The 2 scholars, Professor Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Benga, won the argument. And if you read the General History of Africa, Volume 2, the debate is in there, and it's really, really funny, just watching 2 people slaughter 18.
Must have been very embarrassing for them.
It's been so embarrassing that one would have expected that to be sort of common knowledge and someone to do a documentary about it and so on. But for obvious reasons, none of this has happened.